In our day-to-day parlance, the word rent is used as a synonym for high charges. So when you take a car on rental or when you take a house on rent, that's considered to be rent in our day-to-day parlance. But in economics, the word rent is used in the context of its being a surplus. And surplus of what over what is where we have various theories of rent. The first systematic analysis of rent was done by a classical economist called David Ricardo. And David Ricardo summed up his theory by saying that rent is price determined. It does not determine the price. In fact, what he was saying was that prices of corn around his time were high, and because the prices were high, therefore the rent on land was high. So what he was saying was that it is the price of corn which determined the rent on land and not the other way around. So basically he said rent is price determined, it does not determine the price. Now the important thing that one needs to keep in mind while talking about the Ricardian theory of rent is that rent is only applicable to land, and it is on account of the indestructible powers of the soil, indestructible power of the soil, as well as the differences in the fertility of soil, that rent has to be paid. So basically what David Ricardo did was that he considered rent to be a factor where the supply was fixed, and therefore he associated the word rent only to land.
After reading this module, you shall be able to learn the concept of rent, understand different types of rent, know about different theories of rent, determine the price of fixed factor whose supply is less elastic or inelastic. Unlike variable factor, the marginal productivity theory of distribution fails to determine price of factor whose supply is fixed, example land, or quasi-fixed, example capital equipments, as there is zero marginal product of fixed factor. There exists separate body of theory, that is, theory of rent, which helps explain the pricing of these fixed factors. According to classical theory, rent is the price paid for the use of land. However, in modern theory, the concept of rent is not confined to land. It can be applied to any factor whose supply is inelastic in the short run. There are three different concepts of rent: land rent, economic rent, and quasi rent. The land rent is paid by the tenant to the landlord for hiring land, and the landlord obtains this price because of the fact that the supply of land is scarce. The concept of economic rent is widely applicable in the sense that it is the price paid to any factor over and above what is required to keep the factor in its current employment. In other words, economic rent is a payment to a factor in excess of its opportunity cost. The quasi rent is the earnings of fixed capital equipments. The capital equipments are quasi fixed factors in the sense that the supply of these factors are fixed only in short run, while their supply varies in the long run. The Classical Theory of Land Rent by David Ricardo. The classical theory of rent was first defined and explained by David Ricardo. According to him, rent is that portion of the produce of earth which is paid to the landlord for the use of the original and indestructible powers of the soil. Ricardian concept of rent has two features. Firstly, it is payment to the landlord just for the use of land. It differs from contractual rent, which accounts return on capital invested by the landlord. The portion of landlord's earning which is spent for the improvement of land is considered as rent. Secondly, rent is generated due to the scarcity of land. That is, for an economy, the area of land is fixed. In other words, the supply of land is completely inelastic. Therefore, a price, that is, rent, must be paid for the use of land. Since the land rent appears due to the scarcity of land, given the assumption that all plots of the land are homogeneous, it is also known as scarcity rent.
There is an element of both scarcity as well as there is an element of differential character. What he was trying to say was that look, rent is fixed in supply. It's a gift of nature. It cannot be increased. So the supply of land is perfectly inelastic. And secondly, he also said that if all land was of the same quality. When he said scarcity, he was using the word scarcity in terms of fertility. He said if all land was of the same quality. Mind you, around the time when he was developing his thoughts, land of any quality was plentiful. It is only land of good quality with good fertility that there was an element of scarcity. So what Ricardo has done is he's used he's used the term rent in the context of both the scarcity as well as the differential character in terms of the fertility of land. Now let's take an example, the example that he's taken himself. He talks about a new set of people or immigrants settling down on a new piece of land or trying to colonize a new piece of land. For example, let's say people coming from outside and settling down in a new country. Columbus going to America, Aryans coming to India. And what the settlers would do is they would first settle down on the most fertile land. And land is plentiful, so you could settle down wherever you wanted to settle down. No question of any rent being asked for and any rent being paid. But with the passage of time, what is going to happen is there will be an increase in population. Consequently, there will be an increase in demand for food, and therefore there will be an increase in demand for land. This in turn will lead to, in the first case, it was only A grade land that was brought under cultivation. Now with increased demand for food, B grade land will have to be brought under cultivation. Now as soon as this is done, mind you, A grade land has become scarce. And there is a difference in the fertility of A grade and B grade land. As a result, what will happen is the owners of A grade land will start asking for rent. So basically, rent is emerging firstly because of the scarcity of A grade land, and also secondly because there is a difference in the fertility of A grade and B grade land. So essentially, in terms of the classical theory of rent, rent was defined as a surplus. It was defined as a surplus of the produce of the superior land or the produce of the marginal land over the produce of the pre-marginal land. So basically, it's the difference between the marginal and the produce of the marginal and the pre-marginal land. So essentially, as far as the classical theories of rent are concerned, the concept is confined only to land, and it has elements of scarcity. It also has element of differential character in terms of the fertility.
Scarcity rent. The Ricardian concept of scarcity rent is based on the following assumptions. There is an island with finite size of land. All plots of the land are homogeneous in quality. It is assumed that only one crop will be cultivated in all the plots. All plots are assumed to be owned by a large number of absentee landlords. That is, no landlord will farm the land himself. There is perfect competition among the landlords. Assume that the world market for the crop is also perfectly competitive. The supply decision from our imaginary island has least impact on the market price of the crop. Therefore, each and every farmer is a price taker. Land market is perfectly competitive. No rent. Differential rent arises when quality of plot varies across the land. If one plot is relatively more fertile than the other plot, the average cost of production will be lower in the first one. When price rises over the average minimum cost of production in less fertile land, a surplus will be generated in the more fertile land, and this surplus is called differential rent. Assume that there are two types of plots, type 1 plot and type 2 plot. Type 1 is more fertile than the type 2. This implies that the average cost of production in type 1 is lower than that of in type 2 plot. The marginal and average cost curves of two type of the economic rent is an amount of payment received by the supplier of a factor input in excess of the minimum amount required to retain the factor in its present employment.
Now let's try and understand this concept of transfer earnings. Transfer earnings is the minimum that must be paid to a factor of production so as to retain it in its present employment. If it is paid anything over and above the transfer earnings, then that is regarded as a surplus. Now mind you, each point on the supply curve reflects the transfer earnings of the corresponding unit of that particular factor. The price that is determined by the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve. So the point where the demand curve equals supply curve, at that point there will be no economic rent, but all the preceding units will be earning economic rent. So basically what Mrs. John Robinson is trying to stress on is that rent is applicable both in the short run as well as in the long run. It is applicable not only to land, but is applicable to all the factors of production, including labor, capital and entrepreneurship apart from land. So all the factors can earn rent if the actual earnings happen to be greater than the transfer earnings.
In order to analyze the economic rent, it is important to explain the concept of transfer earning. The transfer earning or price is the payment or price which is necessary to keep a unit of factor in a certain use or industry.
Now let's try and understand a little more about transfer earnings and actual earnings. See, transfer earnings basically would depend upon the nature of elasticity of supply. In case the supply of a factor is perfectly inelastic, all its earnings would be in the nature of economic rent. Let's take the case of a very leading cine star or a leading sports personality or an absolutely rare artifact, painting by Picasso, F.M. Hussein, rare pieces of artwork, or a piece of land in an exclusive locality. Now in all such cases, the supply is perfectly inelastic, and since the supply is perfectly inelastic, therefore whatever the factor earns would be in the nature of its economic rent. But as against that, if you consider the supply of, let's say, unskilled workers in a country like India, where we have oversupply of labor, the supply of unskilled workers would be perfectly elastic. If let's say government announces vacancies for PNs or some other unskilled jobs, we'll find thousands of applications being received, which means that you can hire any number of workers at the given announced wage rate. So here in this case we are saying the supply is perfectly elastic. Now when the supply is perfectly elastic, then in this case the actual earnings will be equal to the transfer earnings and the economic rent would be zero. In the first case, mind you, when I talked about perfectly inelastic supply, all the earnings of the factor would be in the nature of economic rent. Let's take a third case. Let's take a situation like skill jobs, where the supply curve is upward sloping. Skill jobs is very different from unskilled jobs, is also different from let's say cine stars or somebody like Sachin Tendulkar, where the supply is perfectly inelastic. In this case the supply curve would be upward sloping, and here we would find that the portion below the supply curve would be its transfer earnings. The portion above the supply curve and till the point of actual earnings, the intersection of the demand curve and the supply curve, will be the economic rent. And therefore if you break up the total earnings, then the portion will comprise, part of it will be in the nature of economic rent and part of it will be in the nature of transfer earnings.
Economic rent is the excess payment to an input over its transfer earning or opportunity cost. If the market supply of an input is fixed or perfectly inelastic, demand alone determines the input price and all of the payment made to the input is rent. Here, the supply curve parallel to vertical axis. If the market supply of an input is positively sloped or moderately elastic, the area above the supply curve and below the price of input shows the rent. Here, the supply curve of factor input is when the supply curve is perfectly elastic, there will be no rent, the entire income will be transfer earning. When the supply curve of factor is perfectly elastic,
The later economists, particularly Marshall and Mrs. John Robinson, they have extended the concept of rent to cover all the other factors of production as well. Marshall, for example, he thought that the exclusive feature of land was its fixity, the fact that supply of land is perfectly inelastic. But Marshall thought that just as land is fixed because it's a free gift of nature, so also capital could be a fixed factor in the short run. Its supply could be perfectly inelastic in the short run. Therefore, according to Marshall, for a firm to continue in production in the short period, it has to at least recover its variable cost. But if it is recovering anything over and above its variable cost, that will be towards the recovery of the fixed cost, and that would be in the nature of a surplus. According to Marshall, this surplus of the revenue over the fixed cost is what is termed as quasi rent. Similar to rent, but is not exactly rent. So quasi rent basically is a term which is used in the context of factors other than land, essentially in terms of capital, and is a term which is used in the short run. This concept was further extended by Mrs. John Robinson. She has talked in terms of rent as being the surplus or the excess of actual earnings of a factor over its transfer earnings. According to her, rent can accrue to all the factors of production, whether it be land or it be capital, and can accrue both in the short run as well as in the long run. According to her, rent is the excess of actual earnings of a factor over its transfer earnings.
Marshall introduced the concept of quasi rent. It is the earning on capital equipment. It rises due to the inelastic supply of capital equipment in the short run. Unlike supply of land, the supply of capital equipment is not permanently fixed or perfectly inelastic. It varies in the long run. That is, in the long run, the supply of capital equipment becomes elastic. According to Marshall, earning on capital equipment is defined as quasi rent rather than the concept of rent defined in earlier sections. It is a surplus earning enjoyed by the owner of capital in the short run due to an increase in demand for it and will be completely wiped out when supply will increase in response to the increase in demand. The quasi rent can also be defined as revenue generated in the short run less the short run variable cost. Let's explain the concept of quasi rent with the help of an example. Assume that a firm hires a machine on contract and pays a constant amount per period. This kind of payment is fixed and not considered as a variable cost for the firm. If the entrepreneur has only one fixed factor, his total revenue net of the total variable cost is a quasi rent earned by the machine. This quasi rent may be higher than, equal to, or lower than the fixed rental of the machine. Let's explain the concept of quasi. In the long run, when a large number of new firms.
Basically, therefore, what we are trying to say is that in our day-to-day parlance, rent is a surplus. Rent, unlike our concept of rent in our day-to-day parlance, where rent is in the nature of higher charges, in economics, rent is in the nature of a surplus. It is applicable as per the modern theory, not only to land or not only to labor as in case of Marshall, but to all the factors of production. And in terms of the modern theory, it would be in terms of the excess of actual earnings over the transfer earnings of a factor.
Let's now summarize what we have learned in this module. Rent is the price paid to any factor whose supply is inelastic in the short run. There are three different concepts of rent: land rent, economic rent, and quasi rent. Land rent is payment to the landlord just for the use of land. It is generated due to the scarcity of land. Differential rent is another concept of land rent which appears due to qualitative differences, for example, fertility, across the plots of a land. Economic rent is the excess payment to an input over its transfer earning or opportunity cost. If the market supply of an input is fixed or perfectly inelastic, all of the payment made to the input is rent. If the market supply of an input is positively sloped or moderately elastic, the area above the supply curve and below the price of input shows the rent. When the supply curve is perfectly elastic, there will be no rent, the entire income will be transfer earning. Quasi rent arises due to the inelastic supply of capital equipment in the short run. The quasi rent can also be defined as revenue generated in the short run less the short run variable cost.